Most defendants quietly accept their punishment and move on. But when Pam Bondi was hit with an unexpected fine, she didn't just sit back. She struck with such precision that even the judge began to second-guess his ruling. It was supposed to be a routine day in courtroom 3B in the heart of Tampa. For Bondi, it was just another case, another stop on her busy schedule. Having faced countless judges in this very room, nothing about the day seemed unusual, until it was. Seated at the defendant's table, Bondi remained composed, skimming through her notes. Across the room, the city attorney shifted nervously, adjusting his tie. He had no idea the storm that was about to unfold. The case itself was minor. At least it was supposed to be. A simple procedural matter that shouldn't have taken more than 10 minutes. But from the moment Judge Raymond Dalton walked in, Bondi sensed something was off. Dalton was a man who commanded the room without speaking much, tall, with a graying beard and deep-set eyes that carried an air of authority. Most judges would take a moment to review the files, acknowledge the attorneys, and ease into the proceedings. Not Dalton. "Let's get right to it," he said, his voice flat, expression unreadable. Bondi straightened in her seat, sensing the shift in tone. "The court has reviewed the matter at hand," Dalton continued. "After considering the arguments, I find that the defendant is in violation of Local Statute 14B and is therefore subject to a fine of $110,000, payable immediately." Silence. Bondi barely reacted, but inside, her mind was already working. She had expected discussion, maybe even a warning, but a summary judgment with no argument. Even the city attorney glanced at her, looking almost apologetic. He hadn't expected this either. Bondi calmly folded her hands, her voice even. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun proceedings. I haven't had the chance to present my arguments." Dalton barely blinked. "The arguments are irrelevant. The violation is clear. The law is clear." Bondi inhaled slowly, keeping her expression neutral. The room was too still. This wasn't just a ruling, it was a statement. She studied Dalton carefully. His confidence went beyond judicial authority. He wasn't just ruling on a case. He was putting her in her place. "If the law were that clear, Your Honor," she said, her voice measured, "we wouldn't be here. I request the opportunity to present my defense." Dalton leaned back slightly as if he had expected her to push back. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're welcome to try, Ms. Bondi, but I assure you, the outcome will be the same." And that was when she knew this wasn't about the case. It was about her. Bondi adjusted the papers in front of her, more for effect than necessity. The fine itself wasn't the issue. She had fought bigger battles. But the principle? That she couldn't ignore. She met Dalton's gaze directly. "Then, I suppose we should get started." The tension in the room thickened. The city attorney shifted uncomfortably. The court stenographer, silent until now, repositioned in her chair. Even a few spectators in the back leaned forward, sensing something unusual was about to unfold. Bondi took one last glance at the legal brief before her, though she didn't need it. She already knew exactly what she was going to do. Dalton thought. He had the upper hand. He was about to realize just how wrong he was. Pam Bondi turns the tables in courtroom showdown. It's, what's the phrase? Unprecedented. Dalton's jaw tightened. Pam knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't outright challenging him yet, but she was setting the stage, forcing him to respond. The spectators in the gallery, mostly lawyers and clerks waiting for their cases, were now fully invested. A few exchanged glances. Even the bailiff, a man who had likely seen 1,000 hearings just like this one, shifted ever so slightly. Dalton let out a slow breath. "Miss Bondi, this court does not exist for theatrics. If you have a legal argument, make it. Otherwise, the fine stands and we move on." Pam gave a small, knowing smile. There it was. He'd opened the door. She adjusted her papers again, but this time, she didn't look down at them. She looked directly at the judge. "Very well. Let's talk about Local Statute 14B, the one you claim I violated. She tapped her finger on the document in front of her. You say the law is clear, but that's interesting because I happen to know that this very statute has been challenged multiple times over the past 5 years, with varying interpretations. Dalton's eyes narrowed. The language in subsection C, for example, Pam continued, her voice smooth, almost conversational, is so vague that it's been ruled unenforceable in at least 3 separate cases. And let's not forget that, just last year, a ruling from the appellate court found that imposing fines under this statute, without allowing for due process, constitutes a direct violation of constitutional protections. The courtroom fell completely silent. Pam could feel the shift happening. Dalton knew it too. He straightened, his tone sharpening. Those cases do not apply here. Pam didn't miss a beat. Don't they? She turned another page. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they do. The language of the ruling in Reynolds versus Clearwater was pretty clear. An administrative fine issued without evidentiary consideration is subject to reversal on procedural grounds. She let the words sink in before adding, and I'm sure Your Honor wouldn't want to ignore precedent. Dalton clenched his jaw. Pam let the silence stretch just a second longer before delivering the next blow. Unless, of course, this court is prepared to disregard established case law, in which case I'd be happy to file an appeal. Dalton leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. Are you threatening this court with an appeal, Miss Bondi? Pam exhaled through her nose, a quiet laugh devoid of amusement. Your Honor, I don't make threats, I cite the law. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Pam had done something subtle but significant. She had shifted the power dynamic. No longer was she simply a defendant responding to a ruling. She had forced the judge into a position of defense, making him justify his decision rather than issuing unquestioned authority. Dalton knew it too. The city attorney, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may. Dalton lifted a hand, cutting him off. His eyes stayed locked on Pam's. A long pause. Then finally the judge spoke. Very well. You may present your defense. Pam smiled, but only slightly. She wasn't celebrating yet. This was only the beginning. But just as she was about to speak, Dalton did something that made it clear. He wasn't going to make this easy. The judge didn't break eye contact as he leaned forward, lacing his fingers. Together. Proceed, he said, his voice carrying a weight that felt more like a warning than permission. Pam recognized the tactic immediately. This wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about control. He wanted her to understand exactly where she stood in his courtroom. But Pam Bondi wasn't the type to be intimidated. She adjusted her posture, keeping her expression unreadable. Let's start with the language of the statute itself, she said, tapping her papers. Local Statute 14B states that any entity failing to comply with a municipal regulation may be fined. Simple enough, but the issue arises in how compliance is defined. She glanced around the room before continuing. The language is broad, overly vague, and inconsistent with constitutional due process protections. Dalton exhaled slowly, unimpressed. And yet, Miss Bondi, this statute has been enforced repeatedly without issue. Pam tilted her head. That's interesting, she mused, because according to public records, at least 4 previous cases resulted in partial or full dismissals due to the very vagueness I'm pointing out now. She shifted her gaze to the city attorney, then back to Dalton. Unless, of course, you'd like to argue that due process only applies when it's convenient. Dalton's grip on the bench tightened slightly. Miss Bondi, if your argument hinges on vague procedural objections, I suggest you reconsider. The law is enforced as written. A beat of silence. Then Pam replied, evenly, except when it isn't. A murmur spread through the back of the courtroom. Pam didn't need to hear the whispers to know. She had just taken control of the room. Pam picked up another document, holding it up for the courtroom to see. Let's talk about Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg, she said, her voice steady. The defendant in that case was fined under this exact statute, same wording, same enforcement method. But the appellate court ruled that the city's interpretation violated state-level protections. She paused. letting the weight of her words settle. "Do you know what the judge said in that ruling?" She glanced at Dalton before answering her own question. "That the law as applied fails to provide sufficient notice or clear standards for enforcement, rendering it unenforceable under scrutiny." Dalton's face remained unreadable, but the tension in his jaw gave him away. The city attorney shifted forward. "Your Honor, I believe we're getting sidetracked." Pam turned toward him, cutting him off before he could finish. "Counselor, I'd love to hear how you reconcile this ruling with the fine your office is attempting to enforce today. If you have a legal basis that contradicts Henderson, please enlighten us." The attorney hesitated. The silence spoke louder than any argument he could have made. Pam turned back to Dalton. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for consistency. If a higher court has already ruled that this statute is problematic, how does this court justify imposing a penalty under it?" Dalton leaned back slightly, his gaze scanning her, calculating. She knew exactly what he was doing, stalling, searching for an angle to regain control. Finally, he spoke. "The circumstances of that case are not identical to yours." Pam didn't blink. "True. But the precedent applies all the same. The law is either clear or it isn't." Silence. The weight in the room had shifted. Pam could feel it. She had backed Dalton into a corner, not just because he was legally wrong, though he was, but because she had forced him into a position where any decision he made now would be under intense scrutiny. He could push forward, ignore precedent, and risk reversal, or backpedal, conceding that he had acted prematurely. Dalton exhaled slowly. "Miss Bondi, I find your interpretation debatable." Pam allowed herself the smallest smile. "Then, let's debate it." Dalton's nostrils flared slightly. Then, to her surprise, he reached for his gavel. "The court will take a 15-minute recess." He stood before anyone could argue, turned, and disappeared into his chambers. Pam sat, her papers down, her expression calm, but inside, she knew exactly what had just happened. Dalton wasn't ready to concede, but he also wasn't prepared to rule against her outright. He needed time, to think, to strategize, maybe even to look up the case she had just cited. That meant she had him on the ropes, but when he returned, he wouldn't be alone, and what happened next would take this fight to an entirely different level. 15 minutes felt like an hour. Pam remained seated, hands resting lightly on her stack of documents. She wasn't reading them, she didn't need to. The legal precedents, procedural arguments, and case law were all burned into her memory. She was ready. But something about Dalton's abrupt recess didn't sit right. He wasn't the type to hesitate, which meant he was either regrouping or preparing for something she hadn't accounted for. The door to the judge's chamber swung open. Dalton strode back in, but this time he wasn't alone. Beside him was a new presence, a second judge. Pam recognized him instantly, Judge Alan Whitaker, senior judge, higher ranking than Dalton. The moment Whitaker entered, the energy in the courtroom shifted. This wasn't standard protocol. Bringing in another judge mid-hearing wasn't just unusual. It was calculated. Pam adjusted her posture, keeping her face unreadable. Dalton cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, I've requested that Judge Whitaker sit in on this matter." Requested? Pam didn't believe that for a second. Someone had pulled strings. Whitaker gave her a slow nod. His presence was calm, but authoritative. "Miss Bondi, I understand you've raised procedural concerns regarding the enforcement of Statute 14b. Pam met his gaze evenly. "That's correct." Whitaker clasped his hands in front of him. "And you believe this fine should be overturned, based on appellate precedent?" She didn't hesitate. "I don't believe it. I know it." A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. Dalton's lips pressed into a thin line. Whitaker arched an eyebrow. "I appreciate your confidence, but let's discuss specifics. You referenced Henderson versus City of St. Petersburg. Are you aware that a follow-up ruling later clarified that certain interpretations of the statute could remain enforceable under localized judicial discretion?" Pam kept her expression neutral. She had anticipated this. This fight wasn't over, not even close. Pam kept her expression neutral, but inside she felt the shift. So that's what this was. Dalton had stepped back, brought in someone with more authority, and now they were attempting to counter her argument with an overlooked technicality. She folded her hands. I am aware of that ruling, Your Honor. But I also know that the same clarification explicitly stated that enforcement must adhere to strict evidentiary standards, something that, in this case, was not done. Whitaker nodded, as if he had expected her response. Then let's talk about that. The enforcement officer who filed the violation is present in this courtroom. Would you like to cross-examine him? Pam barely hid her surprise. She hadn't anticipated that, but she welcomed it. She turned as a man stood from the back of the room. Officer Brian Calloway, a municipal enforcement officer. Middle-aged, dressed in a crisp Navy uniform, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who rarely had to justify his decisions. Pam kept her voice steady. Yes, Your Honor, I would. Dalton gestured for Calloway to step forward. The officer made his way to the witness stand, took his oath, and sat. Pam stood, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Officer Calloway, can you confirm that you were the one who issued this violation? He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Pam turned slightly toward the jury box, empty but filled with public spectators. And on what basis did you determine a violation had occurred? Calloway exhaled, as if the answer was obvious. The statute is clear. The property in question was not in compliance with municipal code. I documented it and issued the fine. Pam clasped her hands behind her back. Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation? He hesitated. No, ma'am, it wasn't necessary. She gave him a small, almost amused smile. You didn't document the violation, yet you issued a fine? Calloway shifted in his seat. I have years of experience identifying these cases. I didn't need a photo to confirm what I saw. Pam's expression remained calm, but inside, she knew she had just been handed her next argument on a silver platter. She turned back to the bench. Your Honor, in the absence of photographic evidence, written witness statements, or any tangible proof, we are left with nothing more than an individual's subjective assessment. This directly contradicts the evidentiary standards required under the appellate clarification Judge Whitaker referenced earlier. Whitaker's expression didn't change, but he sat back slightly. He knew she was right. Pam pressed forward. So I ask again, how does this court justify imposing a fine under a statute that lacks the required legal foundation for enforcement? The silence in the room was deafening. Dalton's fingers drummed against the bench. He wasn't looking at Whitaker, and that told Pam everything she needed to know. He had expected to win this argument. He had expected Whitaker's presence to back her into a corner. Instead, she had taken his own counterpoint and unraveled the case against her. Dalton exhaled sharply. This court will take another recess. Pam resisted the urge to smile. She knew exactly what was happening. They were running out of ways to push back. But when the court reconvened, what Dalton did next was something no one saw coming. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs. Another recess. That wasn't a good sign, for the judge at least. It meant he was struggling to regain control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. But Pam knew better than to celebrate too soon. Dalton was a man of authority. And if there was one thing people in power hated, it was being challenged. He wasn't going to back down easily. When the court reconvened, Dalton's demeanor had shifted. Gone was the passive confidence he had walked in with earlier. Now his jaw was set, his expression unreadable. Whitaker was still seated beside him, though this time his posture was more reserved. It was clear he had no intention of intervening. At least not yet. Dalton cleared his throat. Miss Bondi, you've presented compelling arguments. His tone was measured, but Pam could hear the tightness in it. He wasn't used to admitting even the smallest concession. However, he continued, this court still finds the core issue remains unchanged. The fine stands. Pam blinked once. Interesting. So he was doubling down. She exhaled slowly, nodding as if considering his words carefully. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to the court stenographer. Can you read back the last statement, please? The stenographer, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, barely hesitated before repeating. The fine stands. Pam turned back to Dalton, and she was ready to deliver the final blow. Your Honor, just so I understand correctly, Pam said, her voice even but firm. Are you stating on record that a municipal fine can be imposed without evidentiary proof, directly contradicting established appellate precedent? Judge Dalton's fingers twitched against the bench. Miss Bondi, this court has discretion. Pam's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. It does, but discretion is not immunity from legal standards. The city attorney shifted uncomfortably, sensing where this was going. Pam straightened, stepping closer to the bench. Let's put this in plain terms, shall we? She continued. If this ruling stands, it sets a precedent that any enforcement officer can issue a fine, based on nothing more than their word. No evidence, no documentation, just an assertion. Dalton's silence told her everything she needed to know. Pam turned, sweeping her gaze across the attorneys, clerks, and bystanders. Imagine the implications, she pressed. A business owner fined for a violation that may or may not exist. A homeowner penalized for something they can't even verify. And, if they challenge it, too bad. The court has discretion. A few heads in the gallery nodded subtly. Pam turned back to Dalton. That's not discretion, Your Honor. That's unchecked authority. The weight of her words settled over the room. Judge Whitaker finally spoke. You're arguing that allowing this fine to proceed without evidence would undermine due process. Pam nodded. Not just due process, judicial integrity. Because the moment we accept rulings based on assertion rather than evidence, the entire legal system starts to erode. Dalton's grip on the bench tightened. He had been backed into a corner. The city attorney interjected. Your Honor, if I may. Dalton held up a hand. His face remained unreadable, but frustration flickered in his eyes. He knew there was no winning this. Not today. Finally, after a long pause, he exhaled. This court finds that the imposed fine does not meet the necessary evidentiary threshold for enforcement. His voice was stiff, reluctant. The fine is overturned. A murmur rippled through the room. Pam gave a slow, polite nod. No satisfaction, no gloating, just quiet certainty. Dalton tapped his gavel against the bench. Court adjourned. Just like that, it was over. Pam gathered her papers, tucking them neatly into her folder. As she turned to leave, she caught Whitaker, watching her, his expression unreadable. Then, just as she stepped toward the exit, Dalton's voice rang out one last time. Miss Bondi. She turned. Their eyes met. I underestimated you. Pam offered a small smile. You wouldn't be the first. With that, she walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor. But as she left, she knew one thing. For certain, this case wouldn't just be forgotten. It had set a precedent. And somewhere in another case, another judge would think twice before assuming they held all the power.